Good afternoon and welcome to the Just Culture Spotlight webinar series. This is the second in our series of webinars. It's something that we probably going to start doing about once a month. So the first webinar that we did is on our YouTube channel. So if you want to check that out, that was on how Just Culture can improve contractor management. And some details around the relationships of how you build good relationships with your contractors. This webinar series is really about providing some information and guidance on various aspects of Just Culture and safety management, and it's an opportunity for you to ask questions around that topic as well. Today we're talking about Just Culture 101. So what is Just Culture? So it's really going back to basics. What is it, this thing that we're talking about? So again, it's an opportunity for you to ask questions, whether that's from the very basic all the way up to the very advanced. So I've got about 20-25 minutes of material that I've prepared that I'll talk through this webinar. And we'll have 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A at the end, but feel free to post your questions anytime, and I'll try and keep an eye on the questions there, and happy to answer those as we go. So what is a Just Culture? Well, probably the first place to start is to talk about very briefly what is culture. And really, we're talking about in the case of an organisation, it's the beliefs, the assumptions, the ways of thinking in the organisation, the values, and then the norms of behaviour. You know, that kind of what happens when nobody's looking, and the beliefs, the assumptions, the ways of thinking, all of those will influence on behaviour. How people go about their work, but also the way people go about their work likewise influences over time the beliefs and assumptions and the ways of thinking. So it's a two-way relationship between those underlying beliefs and those behavioral norms. So if that's culture, all right, what are we talking about when we're talking about a just culture? So the traditional explanation that comes from people like James Reason, who originally and David Marks, who originally came up with the concept, is a culture in which people are not punished for honest errors or mistakes that they make, but that there is a clear line between acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. And so there is accountability for acts of malice or gross recklessness, for example. And so the idea really is to try and create an environment where people are encouraged to report their errors, their blunders, the hazards, or the problems that they encounter in their work, because they're not worried about getting punished for reporting those things. And the idea is that then that prevents these things from being hidden and allows the organisation to address the underlying causes of errors and problems to make the organisation safer, more reliable, and more productive over time. So it has its origins as a safety program. There's also perhaps a truer explanation, a deeper explanation, and that is that just culture is a much wider concept than that. It's really about making justice and fairness a core part of the makeup of the organisation and how it goes about its work. It's about recognizing that building a just and fair organization that is a good thing in of itself. Indeed, who would want to work for an organization that didn't treat its people fairly? So it's about creating a much more positive work environment. And so that means that a just culture is not just about a policy statement, but it's really about a journey of building mutual trust through consistent behavior over time. So there's a lot in all of that. So let's sort of just unpack this a bit. And probably the place that I'll start is talking around human error. Human error, particularly in the safety space, can sometimes be a bit of a controversial topic. There are some who think that as a category doesn't actually exist. or that human error is something that we label, that it's a judgment that we place on people's actions. But that's a bit of a sort of a rabbit hole that is perhaps for another time. So I'm just going to use the term human error in perhaps the colloquial, the way that sort of, that we might use it in an everyday sense of where we take some sort of action or inaction, and the outcome is not what we have intended. So, and when we look at human error in that sort of broad everyday sense, we quickly realize, I think, that human error is ubiquitous. It is something that we as human beings are fallible. We're not perfect, and we make errors all the time in various ways. It could, driving is a really good example. From time to time, usually when we're driving, we do a pretty good job, but we obey all the road rules and all of that. But from time to time, occasionally, we will make errors, usually unintentional. We might forget to change to put our indicator on when we're changing lanes. Maybe we get momentarily distracted and we miss a stop sign or something like that. And so, and if you've ever tried to focus really hard on driving and not make any errors, it's an interesting experiment to try, actually, to sort of see how long you last before, even when you are trying your best and you're really focused on driving and not making any mistakes, how long you can actually keep that up before an error will creep in. So one of the underpinning principles of a just culture is that mistakes and errors will happen even when people are trying their best, but that the workplace can influence how likely certain errors are to occur. So, for example, let's say that we have a hospital and we have a couple of medications in a cabinet next to each other, and they look very similar. They have very similar labels. That is a situation where perhaps a nurse or a doctor comes to get the medication, and particularly when they're busy, they're under pressure, things are stressful, that maybe they might accidentally grab the wrong one and give it to a patient. Whereas if those medications were in different places or they had different labels, that particular error might be less likely to occur. So there's this underpinning idea that the workplace can influence the types of errors that might occur, and also what barriers there are in place to errors that do happen from causing sort of some adverse outcome that we don't want. We can never eliminate human error from the workplace because human beings are fallible and we bring those errors in with us. But there's this idea that by designing good systems, we can reduce the chance of them or mitigate their effects. And so fundamentally then, the question is not, are errors occurring in our organization? They are. It's really about, are we being told about them? And so for many organizations, unfortunately, their approach to human error is a blame culture. That when things go wrong, it's because of bad people making bad choices. And so therefore, if we punish the bad people or we get rid of the bad people, then this will solve our problem. And along with that is an idea that we would call consequence bias, that the worse the outcome, the worse the error must have been. Though when we examine that idea a bit closer, we realize that actually that's not the case. Let's go back to driving as an example. Let's say that I'm driving on the wrong side of the road, in and out of traffic, and through blind luck, I don't cause anyone any harm and I get home safely. I've made a pretty big error in what I'm doing. The consequences were minor. On the other hand, I might be driving along and I am momentarily distracted. I go to change radio stations, for example. I miss a stop sign. I go into an intersection and I hit a cyclist. A momentary lapse of attention, but the consequences of the error are huge. So the two don't necessarily always go together. But the big problem with a blame culture is that it drives errors and mistakes underground. So if we go back to the example of the doctor or the nurse grabbing the medication out of the medicine cabinet and giving it to a patient, the wrong medication, are they going to tell anyone about what happened? Particularly if perhaps we're lucky in this case that nothing bad happens to the patient. If the person thinks they're going to be punished, they're much less likely to say anything and just hope that no one notices. But of course, what that means is that the organization remains unaware of the problem. It's unaware of the problem, it can't learn. And so potentially the next time you have another doctor or nurse and they're under pressure, they're stressed, they're busy, and they're going to grab the wrong medication, except maybe this time the patient is harmed. And so, whereas if that first health practitioner had reported it, then perhaps the hospital could have done something about it in terms of moving the medication, changing the labels, etc. But they can't engage in that systemic improvement and that systemic learning if people are scared they're going to be punished for reporting such things. So some organizations have then adopted what they call a no blame culture. And the idea really behind this is that, well, as long as you report it, you won't be punished or blamed. And this is a big improvement over a blame culture. It's really looking at the role of human factors and systems of work. So human performance, the factors of human performance, such as fatigue, workload, the design of procedures, interfaces, training, and instruction. So looking at those systems of work. And that is a really strong vehicle for continuous improvement. But a purely no blame culture can sometimes lead us to ignore individual choices, which do matter. And you can potentially get the sort of the get out of jail free card problem. Oh, well, as long as I report it, it doesn't matter what I do. When the reality is that there are some actions that are deserving of sanction. Sexual harassment, theft, actions where there can be no justification, and the person would know that there is absolutely no justification for it. So the idea then with a just culture is that it retains the focus on systems of work of a no blame culture, but it retains standards of accountability for individual actions where it's necessary. But importantly, you only get to those questions of individual accountability after you've exhausted all of the system factors and considered that overall context. And then you address those issues of individual accountability if you need to. So really it is about anchoring accountability in human factors and systems thinking. It is about recognizing that people's actions occur within the context of the limits of human performance, within the context of the systems of work. And it's looking at that surrounding context is vital if you are going to treat people in a just and fair way. And that really it's about expanding accountability and deepening accountability for the organization. Is the organization going to take accountability for the systems of work in which it operates, and accountability for continuously improving those systems to reduce the chance of errors, to make those systems work better for human beings who have to work in them. Now, just culture frameworks might have flow charts and things like that to help people work through a just culture approach. But it's important to recognize that a just culture is much more than just chucking in a policy or following a flow chart. Because even something that might seem straightforward, like let's say a staff member has broken a rule, that might seem pretty like, well, okay, they've broken the rules, and so therefore a disciplinary approach is appropriate because they've deliberately broken a rule. just culture, if you are implementing it properly, says, well, hang on, we need to ask, why did they break that rule? What's going on with the systems of work? What's the context in which this occurred? Perhaps the employee didn't know the rule, or perhaps they applied the wrong rule, and this might come back to training or issues with how the rules are written. There might be ambiguities, for example. There might be conflicting rules. There might, a manager might have said, do this job by the book, but also get it done by 5 p.m. And then the employee has to choose, well, I can't follow both. Which one is going to take priority over the other? We've seen this frequently, say, in the trucking industry in times gone by, where if the truck driver is going to complete their schedule as it's been given to them and written down, they have to speed, because there is absolutely no way to meet that schedule unless they do that. The rules might be impractical. Maybe it requires using equipment that is not available because it's in the maintenance shop. Maybe that the staff member is making a judgment call to disobey a rule to help the organization, and they are judging it based on their consideration of the risk, and maybe the reward for the organization is worth the risk. And yes, perhaps sometimes there are examples of disobeying rules for selfish reasons, going to get home early on a Friday or something like that. That does happen, but comparatively rare compared to the others, where usually it's a problem of some sort with the rules or surrounding it. So I see a question there from Marlon in the chat. Are there any examples of just culture being used outside of safety? Yeah, absolutely. Then that's a really good, and that's raises a really good point, in that while just culture came out of safety and is often viewed as a safety program, it isn't just a safety thing. It can be used to help manage risk in the organization generally, whether that's financial, reputational, all sorts of different types of risks. It's also and also just to create a more positive culture generally, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later. But to give you an example, in the financial industry, there was a financial firm in Australia here who introduced just culture framework, and that was around making decisions around investments. And one of the principles of just culture, we're talking about that combating consequence bias. And what that does is allows people's the assessment of people's actions and decisions to be based on the quality of their decision making rather than just the outcomes, which they might not be able to control. So what that does mean is that, for example, when people are making investment decisions, they are more likely to be able to take considered risks to innovate, because as long as the quality of their decision making is good. And so it unlocks that people's ability to take some considered risks and innovate, but still provide a mechanism where if people are taking crazy, unjustifiable risks to address those issues, perhaps through coaching or other mechanisms, even if the outcome actually in this case worked out quite well, perhaps the investment came off, but it's not really the kind of decision that the organization wants to encourage, because it was just it was more, the result was more due to luck than actually good quality decision making. So yeah, thanks, Marlon. That's a really great question. Some things to remember with just culture then. One, as I mentioned, is that it's not just a safety thing. But the idea is it's about treating people fairly. We are anchoring accountability in human factors and systems thinking, and that means that we are also extending accountability to the organization, and the organization taking accountability for the systems of work it operates. And the idea then is to allow for both the individual and the organization to learn and improve over time. And that organizational learning is really important, that systemic improvement, to make it less likely that future error is going to occur, that procedures actually work better and more smoothly. Another thing to bear in mind as well is that a just culture processes should be something that is not just when things go wrong. That it should be part of your normal workflow, and particularly in the context of exceptional outcomes. If something goes really, really well, a just culture framework allows you to examine that and try and understand, well, why did that go so well? Is there something that we can replicate for next time? Things that we can learn from that. The other benefit of making just culture a part of your regular workflow is that it reduces that association of just culture as being something that happens when something goes wrong, which is what you don't want. You want this idea of learning to be something that is a part of the organization's daily life, not just a response to adverse outcomes. So by taking this just culture approach, it really, you're creating a much more just and fair workplace, because you're putting accountability in the context of the overall systems of work. That feeling that they can bring up issues and hazards and mistakes means you get a much bigger increase in safety data from increased staff reporting. And then if you're taking action on that will in due course reduce your workplace injuries, and of course all of the losses, the delays, the damages from human error, and poor system processes. So it's really about systemic improvement over time. You're also better able to identify those gaps between what we might say is work as imagined, which how we might at head office write the procedures and imagine that the work is being done, and when on a good day, when everything is going well and everything is smoothly and all the equipment's working and all that sort of stuff, the gaps between that work as imagined and work as done, the messy reality of work as it's done on a day-to-day basis, where someone's off sick, where the job is more complicated than usual, where there's time pressures and other things, competing priorities and other things going on. And being able to better identify those gaps through that increase in reporting allows you to then address those gaps and make for a safer and more reliable organization. It also then will therefore help with your regulatory and ethical compliance, better performing work systems, better protection against psychosocial hazards, because people are more willing to report the challenges, the issues that they are encountering in their work. So particularly around some of those things of workload or low job control, or perhaps exposure to harassment and bullying, or organizational justice generally. So much better protection against psychosocial hazards. You're also not punishing people for errors that are system induced, which is fundamentally unjust. You're going to have more effective risk management generally, because obviously those things that reporting is going to help you not just in regards to safety risks, but also other types of risk, say financial, reputational, quality risks, etc. And you're really fostering an mindset of continuous improvement and innovation and creativity. And of course, having an environment where people feel like they have a voice and they can have influence in their organization. Oh wow, I've encountered an issue, I reported it, and action was taken, and now things are better. Now the procedure works better. Well, creating that kind of environment is massively positive for employee well-being. It encourages and helps underpin improved team performance. It makes you more attractive to talented employees, because you'll be employer of choice, because people feel like, oh, I actually have value, I matter in this organization, I can have an impact. And that then obviously leads to a reduction in employee turnover costs, reduction in legal costs from workplace grievances and disputes. So it's just all the benefits of just having a much more positive workplace culture, a much more engaged workforce. I've got a question here from LinkedIn. If I want to learn more about Just Culture, where can I go? Yeah, great question. I've got I did a video series earlier this year with 𝗲𝘂𝘀𝘁, who's also another person who does a lot of work in Just Culture, and we talk about in that video series about different types of Just Culture. And about accountability and a bit about implementation and so on. So that series is available on YouTube, so you can check that out. That's worth having a look at. If you're looking at textbooks, James Reason's original book, Managing the Risks of Organizational Accidents, is that sort of foundation introduction to Just Culture. It's a small part of a larger book, but the original ideas of Just Culture are in there. Sidney Dekker, his book, Just Culture, 3rd edition, is quite strong on restorative Just Culture, about how you restore trust and relationships after an adverse event. So that's worth having a look at. 𝗲𝘂𝘀𝘁, his book Quantum Safety, talks about a revised Just Culture, where you're sort of taking the classic ideas of Just Culture and the restorative Just Culture elements and sort of bringing those together and sort of creating a hybrid, that's a really good source to read. I've been developing a Just Culture implementation guide. It's still a little bit work in progress, but it's sort of 90% there. And so if you're interested in that implementation guide, feel free to send me an email, and I'll send that to you. So that's sort of more on the practical, how you implement this sort of thing. We're almost coming up to time, so I'm going to open things up to any questions, other questions that people might have. So please do feel free to chuck any questions in the chat. While waiting to see if there's any sort of more questions that come out, I'll just mention. I mentioned a moment ago about different types of Just Culture. Because there are some different models around that you can look at. There's sort of the classic James Reason, David Marks type of Just Culture, which is sort of looking at what happened and then what is a fair response based on what happened. There's Sidney Dekker's restorative Just Culture, where it's really asking things around, who's hurt, what do they need, who is responsible to address each need. So that's really, again, about restoring trust and relationships, which is really, really important. And you have sort of the more hybrid ones that try to bring the best elements of both of those, asking those sort of questions around, well, why did this make sense at the time? And then what can we learn from both an individual and an organizational perspective? So there are some different models that you can draw from. But ultimately, I think when it comes to Just Culture, the best way to do it is to co-create it with your staff, an individual framework and model that's going to work for you. You can draw ideas from different places, but every organization is different. So you really want to create something that's going to be appropriate for the context of your organization, its history, its people, so that it's effective. We have a question from the website, and it's a really good question. I've heard of Just Culture having a bad name in some companies. Where has it been used as a tool to blame people? How do you prevent that from happening? Yeah, and that's something that has unfortunately happened. There's this term like, oh, I got just cultured, and usually it's instances of poor implementation. I mean, ultimately and unfortunately, anything can be weaponized. So sometimes these processes have been weaponized. Where I think this has happened is when organizations have adopted a Just Culture policy and a Just Culture framework, but haven't really understood and adopted the principles behind Just Culture. They're not embedding accountability in human factors and in systems thinking. Perhaps they don't have trained people doing Just Culture reviews, and they're perhaps defaulting to consequence bias and things like that. Or there might be mistakes in implementation around perhaps having someone's direct supervisor conduct a just culture review, which if you're trying to assess the person's actions within its context, the supervision that and the instructions that they're given is part of that context. So if the supervisor is the one who's doing the just culture review, you can see there might be issues there, because one of that context to examine is their supervision. And you're not obviously, and you don't want to scapegoat the frontline employee. You don't want to scapegoat the supervisor either. So thinking about those implementation issues. So yes, unfortunately, if it's not implemented well, you can get a situation where you're creating the very environment that you're trying to get away from, which is unfortunate. So what I would say is really make sure you understand the principles underlying just culture. It's not just a policy or a flowchart that you stick on there and think, oh, okay, right, we're all solved. And you got to really make sure that your people understand it and that you train well in it to make it work. They're sort of the two main things I'd say. All right, we're basically at time, so So I just wanted to thank you for joining us today and the great questions. I hope you found this webinar helpful. The next webinar we'll probably do late January, when people are back from the end of year break. I'm thinking it will probably be around bridging perhaps the gap sometime between law and safety, and where just culture sort of fits in with all of that. So be on the lookout on LinkedIn or on YouTube, and we'll or the website, and we'll announce when the date and time of the next webinar. If you have any questions or suggestions for a future webinar, you can go to the website www.justculture.com.au/askquestions, and you can use that both to post questions for the next webinar or to suggest a future topic, or just ask any general just culture question. And there's an option to put your email there if you want to. You don't have to, but if you do, put your email there and you're asking a question, we'll get back to you with an answer. At the end of this webinar, there'll be a QR code on the screen as well that will take you directly to that link if you want to post a question there. All right, thank you once again for joining. I hope you have a wonderful end of year break. A Merry Christmas for those of you who celebrate Christmas. Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah. Obviously, I know it's a difficult time given recent events in Australia on that one. But however you mark the end of the year, I hope you have a joyous one, a restful one. And hope to see you for the next webinar in January. Thanks very much. Have a great week.